What happened over the following months challenged everything the scientific community believed about lion social behavior and intelligence. The lioness I had helped, whose name I learned from local Nasai, was Jengo, meaning to build, had apparently shared her experience with other members of her pride. Within 2 months, I had 3 more nighttime visitors, all carrying sick or injured cubs to my doorstep. The second case was Jengo's sister Amara, who arrived with a cub suffering from severe dehydration after getting separated from the pride during a drought. The third was an older lioness named Kessie, whose cub had been injured in a fall from a rocky outcrop. Each time the pattern was identical. Approach at night, place the cub at my door, back away, and wait. They had developed a protocol for seeking human medical assistance. Dr. Sarah Oching from the University of Nairobi came to study what was happening at my rehabilitation center. She was initially skeptical, believing that I was anthropomorphizing normal animal behavior. But after witnessing her first nighttime delivery, she became one of the most vocal advocates for recognizing the complex cognitive abilities of wild lions. The fourth case changed everything. It was Jengo again, but this time she wasn't alone. She had brought her entire pride with her. 7 adult lionesses and their cubs, all approaching my cabin together in the middle of the night. But none of the cubs appeared to be sick or injured. This was something else entirely. I watched from my window as Jengo led the group to my front door. She placed something at my doorstep, but it wasn't a cub. It was a freshly killed impala. The pride had brought me a gift. They were sharing their hunt with me, acknowledging me as a member of their social group. In lion society, sharing food is one of the highest honors. They were telling me I belonged, but the gift came with a request. After placing the impala, Jengo walked to the edge of my property and began vocalizing in a pattern I had never heard before. It wasn't a roar or a growl. It was almost conversational. She was trying to communicate something specific. I followed her calls and discovered what she wanted to show me. About half a mile from my cabin, Jengo led me to a poacher's camp. 3 men with automatic weapons and a truck full of ivory and rhino horn. They had been operating in the area for weeks, and the local wildlife had been avoiding the region. But Jengo wasn't just showing me the threat. She was asking for my help in dealing with it. I immediately contacted the Kenya Wildlife Service, and within hours, a team of rangers had arrested the poachers and confiscated their illegal cargo. But what happened next proved that Jengo's intelligence went far beyond simple problem solving. She had been watching me. She had learned my routines, my relationships, my connections to the human world. She knew I could mobilize help against threats to her territory. Over the following year, this pattern repeated itself multiple times. Jengo would alert me to poaching activities, injured animals in need of help, and even potential threats to my own safety. She had appointed herself as my guardian, just as I had become the guardian of her cubs. We had formed an unprecedented partnership between human and predator. The scientific implications were staggering. Dr. Oching published our findings in the Journal of Animal Cognition, and the response from the international research community was immediate. Teams of researchers from around the world came to study what became known as the Jengo Protocol. We were documenting the evolution of a new form of interspecies cooperation in real time. But for me, the most meaningful moments weren't the scientific breakthroughs or media attention. They were the quiet evenings when Jengo would bring her cubs to play in my yard while she rested in the shade of my porch. Watching lion cubs tumble around my garden while their mother dozed peacefully nearby felt like living in a fairy tale. The cubs grew up thinking of me as part of their extended family. They would approach me without fear, play with my equipment, and even sleep on my porch during hot afternoons. I had become the world's first human pride member, and the experience was transforming my understanding of what was possible between humans and wild animals. The breakthrough moment came when Jengo's Original cub, the one I had saved that first night, returned as a young adult with cubs of her own. She approached my cabin with the same confidence her mother had shown, placed her own sick cub at my doorstep, and backed away slowly. The behavior had been passed down to the next generation. I was witnessing the birth of a new cultural tradition. In Lion Society, Dr. Oching was there to document this historic moment. As we watched 3 generations of lions interact with complete trust in human presence, she turned to me with tears in her eyes. "Jake," she said, "we're not just studying animal behavior anymore. We're documenting the evolution of a new relationship between humans and one of our planet's most magnificent predators." The young lioness I had saved as a dying cub was now teaching her own offspring that humans could be allies in survival. The knowledge was spreading through the pride and even to neighboring groups. We began receiving reports of similar behavior from other parts of Kenya and Tanzania. The Jengo Protocol was becoming a widespread phenomenon, but the most incredible development came during the dry season when food was scarce and competition was fierce. Instead of avoiding human settlements, as lions traditionally do, Jengo's pride began coordinating their hunting activities with local Maasai herders. They would drive prey animals toward areas where the herders could benefit from the hunt while avoiding livestock altogether. The Maasai elders were amazed. For generations, they had viewed lions as threats to their cattle and their livelihoods. But Jengo's pride was actively helping them hunt wild game while protecting their domestic animals. It was a level of interspecies cooperation that had never been documented before. This story reached its climax during a severe drought that threatened all wildlife in the region. Water sources were drying up and animals were dying of thirst. Jengo approached my cabin one evening, but instead of bringing a sick cub, she led me to a dried riverbed where her pride was gathered. They were all showing signs of severe dehydration, but instead of competing for the little water that remained, they were sharing it equally among the cubs, first, and the adults. Immediately organized a water delivery using trucks from the Kenya Wildlife Service, but Jengo wasn't finished. She led me to 3 other locations where different animal species were suffering from the drought. Elephants, zebras, giraffes, all in desperate need of water. She had appointed me as the coordinator of drought relief for the entire ecosystem. Working with local authorities and international conservation groups, we established emergency water stations throughout the region. The drought response saved hundreds of animals and established new protocols for wildlife management during climate emergencies. But none of it would have been possible without Jengo's intelligence and her ability to communicate complex needs across species barriers. Today, 5 years after that first midnight encounter, my rehabilitation center has become a model for human-wildlife cooperation, studied by researchers from around the world. Jengo is now a grandmother, and her extended family includes over 30 lions across 3 generations, all of whom view me as a trusted ally. The security footage from that first night, when a desperate lioness placed her dying cub at my doorstep and backed away slowly, has been viewed millions of times online. But for me, the real miracle isn't the viral fame or scientific recognition. It's the quiet moments when I sit on my porch at sunset, watching lion cubs play in my yard while their mothers rest peacefully nearby, knowing that we've created something beautiful together. Jengo taught me that intelligence, compassion, and the desire to protect our young are universal traits that transcend species boundaries. When a mother is desperate enough, she will overcome millions of years of evolutionary programming to seek help wherever she can find it. And sometimes that help comes from the most unlikely source of all: a human who is willing to open his door to a wild lioness in the middle of the night and trust that her intentions were pure. The bond we formed has changed both of our lives forever. I'm no longer just a wildlife rehabilitator. I'm a bridge between 2 worlds, a translator between species, and proof that with enough trust and understanding, humans and wild Animals can become partners in survival rather than enemies in competition. Every night when I check my security monitors, I hope to see those familiar footsteps approaching my door, because I know that each visit from Django and her family represents another opportunity to strengthen the incredible bond we've built together. A bond that started with a mother's desperate love and has grown into something that's changing the way we think about our relationship with the natural world. I've lived in the African wilderness for 8 years, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened at 2:17 a.m. on a moonless night in October. My name is Jake Morrison, and I run a small wildlife rehabilitation center on the edge of the Masai Mara in Kenya. What I'm about to tell you sounds impossible, but I have security footage to prove every word. That night changed everything I thought I knew about animal intelligence and maternal instinct. I was deep asleep in my cabin when the motion sensors triggered. Living alone in lion territory, you learn to wake up fast when something trips your alarms. I grabbed my flashlight and checked the security monitor. What I saw made my blood run cold. A massive lioness was walking directly toward my front door, carrying something in her mouth. She moved with purpose, not the random wandering of a curious predator. This was intentional. My first instinct was to grab the rifle. 8 years in the bush teaches you that when a 400-pound apex predator approaches your home at night, you prepare for the worst. But something about her body language stopped me. She wasn't stalking. She wasn't hunting. She was walking like she had somewhere important to be, like she was on a mission. I watched through the window as she approached my front porch. The security lights illuminated her fully, and I could see what she was carrying. It was a cub, a tiny motionless cub that looked barely alive. The lioness stopped exactly 3 feet from my door and did something that defied every instinct she should have had. She gently placed the cub on my doormat, looked directly at the security camera, as if she knew I was watching, and then backed away slowly. She didn't run. She didn't slink into the shadows. She backed away, maintaining eye contact with my door the entire time. Then she positioned herself about 20 meters away and lay down. She was waiting. A wild lioness had just delivered a dying cub to my doorstep and was now waiting to see what I would do about it. I stood frozen for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. This went against everything I knew about lion behavior. Lionesses don't approach human dwellings. They don't leave their cubs with strangers. They certainly don't trust humans with their most precious possessions. Yet here was undeniable proof that sometimes desperation can override millions of years of evolutionary programming. The cub wasn't moving. From my window, I could see its tiny chest barely rising and falling. Whatever was wrong, it was serious, and time was running out. I made a decision that could have cost me my life. I slowly opened my front door. The lioness immediately stood up, her muscles tense and ready, but she didn't charge. She watched. She was giving me permission to approach her baby, but warning me that any wrong move would be my last. Knelt down beside the cub, and my heart broke. It was a female, maybe 6 weeks old, and she was burning with fever. Her breathing was shallow and labored. There were infected bite marks on her tiny legs, and her eyes were glazed with pain. Without immediate medical intervention, she would be dead before sunrise. But here's what made this even more incredible. This lioness had somehow identified me as someone who could help. You see, my rehabilitation center specializes in treating injured wildlife. Over the years, I've helped hundreds of animals recover from injuries and illness. Word travels fast in the animal kingdom, and somehow this desperate mother had learned that the human in the small cabin could heal the wounded. She had made a calculated decision to trust me with her dying child. I looked up at the lioness and spoke softly. I know it sounds crazy, but I explained what I was going to do. I told her I needed to take her cub inside to treat her injuries. I told her it would take time, but that I would do everything in my power to save her baby. The lioness tilted her head as if she was listening, as if she understood every word. When I gently lifted the cub, the lioness took a step forward. Every muscle in my body tensed. But instead of attacking, she made a sound I had never heard from a lion before. It was almost like a whimper, a sound of pure maternal anguish. She was letting me know that she was entrusting me with the most important thing in her world. I carried the cub inside and immediately began emergency treatment. The bite wounds were severely infected, and the fever was dangerously high. I started her on antibiotics administered 4 fluids and used cooling pads to bring her temperature down. Through my window, I could see the lioness hadn't moved. She was maintaining her vigil, waiting for news about her child. The next 12 hours were touch and go. The cub's condition was critical, and there were moments when I thought I was going to lose her. But slowly, gradually, she began to respond to treatment. Her fever broke around noon, and for the first time since her arrival, she opened her eyes and made a soft mewing sound. I had never been so relieved to hear an animal cry. I stepped outside to update the lioness on her cub's condition. She immediately stood up and approached to within 10 feet of me. I could see the intelligence in her eyes, the desperate hope of a mother waiting for news. I held up the cub so she could see her baby was alive and alert. The lioness made a sound that can only be described as a sigh of relief. Over the next 3 days, the cub's recovery was remarkable. Her appetite returned, her playfulness emerged, and she began to show all the signs of a healthy young lion. But during this time, something even more extraordinary was happening. The lioness never left. She had taken up permanent residence in my yard, creating a protective perimeter around my cabin. She was standing guard, making sure nothing could harm her cub while it recovered. On the 4th day, I knew it was time for the reunion. The cub was fully recovered and ready to return to the wild. I carried her outside, and the lioness immediately approached. The reunion was one of the most beautiful things I have ever witnessed. The mother began grooming her cub, checking every inch of her body, purring so loudly I could feel the vibrations. The cub nuzzled into her mother's warmth, completely content and unaware of how close she had come to death. But then the lioness did something that still gives me chills. She looked directly at me and slowly lowered her head in what could only be interpreted as a bow. She held that position for several seconds, making sure I understood her gratitude. Then she picked up her healthy cub and began to walk away. But after about 50 meters, she stopped, turned back, and roared once. It wasn't a threatening roar. It was a farewell, a thank you, a promise that she would remember what I had done. That should have been the end of the story, but it was actually just the beginning. Word of what had happened spread through the local Maasai community, and soon I was getting visits from wildlife officials, researchers, and journalists. Everyone wanted to understand how a wild lioness had made the decision to seek human help for her dying cub. The security footage went viral, and suddenly my small rehabilitation center was famous worldwide. But the real validation came 6 weeks later when I heard familiar footsteps on my porch at 3 a.m. I checked the security monitor, and there she was, the same lioness. But this time she wasn't carrying a sick cub. She was carrying a healthy one. She had brought her other offspring to meet me, to introduce the rest of her family to the human who had saved her daughter's life. This time I didn't hesitate. I went outside immediately and sat down on my porch steps. The lioness approached with confidence, placing her second cub at my feet. But this cub was healthy and curious, exploring my porch with typical kitten playfulness. The lioness was making a social call. She was saying thank you by sharing her family with me. As I sat there with 2 lion cubs playing around my feet, while their mother watched protectively, I realized I was witnessing something unprecedented in human-animal relationships. This lioness had not only overcome her natural fear of humans, but had actually formed a bond of trust and gratitude. She had made me an honorary member of her pride,